As we were waiting to come out here, you were in the hallway there, the green room back there, in the bowels of this theater, and you never stopped directing because you just started sweeping up. There was a broom, you grabbed it, and you started using it.
Well, it's always, these beautiful events. You come out and bask in the presence of the public, but in the back, it always looks to me like a place where the assassination is going to happen. Or at least I try to sweep up so the pictures will look good.
Always thinking about the story. So I think to understand the conversation fully, I think people need to know where you were in your career. So 2 years earlier, Robert Evans asked you to direct The Godfather. Why do you think he did that?
Well, of course, The Godfather was not a sure thing by any means in those days. There had been a few movies, I think one called The Brotherhood, that told the story of an Italian-style gangster organization. It hadn't done well. And so it wasn't as though The Godfather or a movie of that type was really necessarily a good move. And a lot of directors turned it down. I know Costa Gavras turned it down. I think Peter Bogdanovich turned it down. Several people turned it down. And certainly the great Ilya Kazan had turned it down. The script they had of it wasn't too great, I remember. At any rate, I had made a film called The Rain People, which I had written, and it was promising. And thank you. I liked The Rain People. It was, the kind of film I really was interested in making. I wanted to make personal films that I wrote from scratch, the story as well as the screenplay. And I got to do it with The Rain People, although it wasn't very little known. But a couple of people had seen it and thought it held some promise. One of them was Peter Bart, who was a head of production, associate of Bob Evans, and I think he brought the attention to Bob Evans. And they looked at the situation. I was a screenwriter, or I was making my living as a screenwriter, so they felt if the script needs some work that I would be able to pitch in and do it without a separate fee. Secondly, I was young and unproven, which meant one thing, maybe I would have some knowledge of the new equipment that was beginning to find its way in the film business, but more important, I could be pushed around. And thirdly, I was Italian-American, and there had been some echoes of, this Italian characters, Italian gangsters were, something of a cliche and might be offensive to the Italian-American community at large, and then they could be blamed on me because I was. So I think those are the reasons why I got the job.
And then you did okay with it. It does, pretty well. And naturally, this being Hollywood, they come to you and say, okay, well, we're going to do it again. We want to do The Godfather 2. And then all of a sudden, you had some leverage.
That's true. For the second film, the first film was such a nightmare for me. I had 2 sons, and my wife was pregnant. I had absolutely no money, and to say they weren't happy with what I was doing and my decisions and choices, either in the way I wanted to make the film and nor the actors I wanted, I really was waiting to get fired every week on The Godfather. I know you've heard that story, but it's pretty much true. And several times I thought I was fired, only to discover that they were going to stay with me. So it was such an unpleasant experience to be unwanted by the management for so long that there was no possibility that I would want to do a second film. I wasn't that interested in gangsters. I was thrilled that I had, as we say, as Mario Puzo, the wonderful Mario Puzo who wrote the book, that I had dodged the bullet, as he used to say. Because I really thought the film was going to be a disaster. mainly from the reaction of my own studio that was producing it. They were so unhappy with everything I was doing. They didn't like the casting, they didn't like Al, they didn't like Marlon. They didn't want Marlon.
What's wrong with these people?
It sounds funny, but you gotta always look at these things in context of the period. And Marlon had been in a film called Quemada, which was not successful, and he was supposedly very difficult and would cause the production lots of delays, which didn't turn out to be the case. But to make a long story short, I said I absolutely do not want to do it, but I think I would be. I liked Mario Puzo very much. I absolutely I enjoyed so much working with him. He was such a wonderful man. And I said, I'll work on a script for a second Godfather, and I'll even help out as a kind of associate producer, but let's choose a younger director, because I just didn't want to go through it again, And they said, well, okay. And when the time came, they asked me, okay, who is it that you have chosen to do the second Godfather? And I said, well, he's a director named Marty Scorsese. And they said, absolutely not. That's a terrible idea. So that was sort of the tenor of what it was. So little by little, we did make a deal. I said I want to have total control, hence the power. I wanted $1 million, which was fantasy number, to toss out just to shock them. But they said, okay. But the third condition I gave them was that it had to be called The Godfather Part 2. And this was the sticking point. They did not want to have a movie called Part 2. They felt that that would be confusing to the public. Public would think that it was the second half of the movie they had just seen. There had never been an American movie called something Part 2. But finally they gave into it, and then of course there was a series of Part 2, Part 3, Rocky 5, and
Yeah, I don't see a lot of people passing on Rocky 5 because they were worried that they didn't know what would happen in the first four. Your stories don't reflect terribly well on management at Paramount, but part of the deal also was that you said, you've got to let me make the kind of movie that I originally set out in this business to make, and you made the conversation contingent on your deal, correct?
that is true, but I didn't say that. In other words, I squeezed the conversation in without making that a stipulation, but they were being nice to me to allow me to do this script. But that wasn't one, in truth, that wasn't one of the conditions.
But you knew you had them over a barrel, and if you said, I'm going to make this movie, they weren't about to, they just gave you $1 million, they weren't about to stop you.
Well, and at the time of this going on, before The Godfather, the year and a half or so before, I had the script of the conversation, and I was trying to get someone to let me make it, and you literally go hat in hand, beg people to let you do this movie, and no one was interested. And in fact, oddly enough, I had sent it even to Marlon Brando to play the part in the conversation, and then I got a phone call where I actually spoke to Marlon on the phone, which was a thrill for New York Theater School from that time, and he told me he admired it, but he didn't think it was for him, so he turned me down. It's before I did The Godfather.
So with this ability to make the conversation you mentioned before, like with the Ring People, the movies you wanted to make were movies that you conceived of, you wrote, and you directed, like the conversation, not a big project like The Godfather.
Right. I mean, I think anyone around the movie business knows that, the heavy lifting is in the writing of it. I mean, if someone's written a book or a play, they've already done the hard part, and for you, sometimes it's tricky to adapt it because it doesn't lend itself immediately. In the case of The Godfather, it's quite long, and you have to figure out ways how to get it all into an hour and a half or what have you. In fact, a lot of time that leads to very creative solutions. And in The Godfather, just as a note, the ending where there's the baptism intercut with all the murders of the opposing families, that was something I came up with, not because I thought it would be especially dramatic, but because I was trying to figure out how to take 60 pages of the novel and put it into 4 pages of the script. So I got the idea to intercut everything with the baptism ceremony. So sometimes the act of adapting a novel can be a very creative thing. But generally speaking, it's really hard to write a story from scratch and a lot easier to adapt one that already exists.
What interested you about this story, about the conversation?
Well, the truth is, number one, I had seen a film called Blow Up. And I just thought Blow Up was a beautiful film. And thank you for Michelangelo. But thank you also for appreciating that film. And I just thought that Blow Up was the kind of movie that I really wanted to make, that it was personal, that it was also mysterious and had narrative drive. You were interested in what it was, and yet it was a personal film. In those days, the younger filmmakers, in our 20s and early 20s, wanted to make personal films. That was because we had been imprinted by all the films that had come from Europe. So when I saw Blow Up, I was just so impressed. And when you're young, I think it's okay to sort of follow in the direction or imitate someone you admire, because you really can't imitate them. You're going to try to imitate them, but you're going to end up with what you can do. So I set out to do a film, and I had been having a conversation with a director you may know of named Irvin Kershner, who had done the second Star Wars film. He was an older guy and very, very nice to us younger fledgling directors, and I was talking to him about how interesting it was that there was technology now, microphones you could put across a city block and aim at the mouth of a person and actually get that person's conversation. It wouldn't be interesting if there was a mystery story in which some parts of it were left out and you had to piece together what was really going on. And what is so meaningful to a younger filmmaker is that he was encouraging. He said, "Yeah, that's a good idea. You should try to do that." And so I, with the vision of wanting to do something like Michelangelo's Blow Up, and with the fact that Irvin Kershner had encouraged me for my surveillance idea, I began to try to write it, and didn't exactly know what I was doing. But when you write, very often you don't know. You just set off on telling the story as best you can, and that's what I did, and I wrote the script.
It's tricky with a movie like The Conversation, so I'm going to do something, and the lights are such in this theater that I can't really see you guys. So will the people who have not seen this movie please applaud? So I'm glad I asked, because I don't want to give anything away in our conversation about The Conversation, but we can portray this because it's the opening scene. That opening scene of recording the conversation that then becomes the focus of the film, really, is an amazing thing to look at, an amazing thing to hear, and much of this movie is about what you hear. My understanding is that the plot point that is revealed in that is essentially what happened. Shooting that scene in Union Square in San Francisco, really enormously difficult. Tell people how you sort of manage that, and what they're going to see.
We did it the real way they would have done it. There were Union Square surrounded by buildings, taller buildings all around the park, and the idea was there was going to be a couple, a man and a woman, having what appeared to be a very mundane, "Oh, a nice day, oh, what are you eating? I'm going to have lunch, blah, blah, blah." And yet, you began to realize that someone was going to great efforts to record it, which immediately made the conversation they were having, which on its face value seemed like nothing, seemed like maybe it wasn't about nothing. And we actually put the cameras on these tall buildings with special microphones and zoom lenses to, in effect, shoot the scene as if we were really doing this surveillance job. And I had done by then a lot of research, and there would be other ways. You would have someone on the ground with a recorder in a shopping bag trying to get as close as they could. In other words, you would use 3-4 methods on the theory that some would get some parts of it, some would get other parts of it, but you might